On the weather front tonight, it will be colder tonight with an overnight low of 45 degrees for the area. The high reading at the Civic Center today was 59. Tomorrow's high will be about 66. More rain tomorrow, and we predict there will be no smog in the basin. Now back to music.
Accident or suicide? Probably no one will ever know. No suicide note, apparently no recent personal disaster. No easy clues to his state of mind at the instant of death. But is it really important to know? After all, if a man or woman wants to commit suicide, how can anyone stop them? Should anyone try? The answer to both questions must be yes, because current medical research demonstrates that the desire to die is a cry for help from a person no longer able to cope with the pressures of living, a plea for sympathy and understanding, even a wish for life. Our need to understand self-murder is as old as our culture. The Bible describes 7 such deaths. And who hasn't felt a pang for the sacrifice of Romeo and Juliet? But in the last decade, science has begun to give us the knowledge to deal with suicide, to help the suicidal soul. Statistics can help prove our point, but how can I make statistics become living people? For example, at least 25,000 deaths will be attributed to suicide in the course of this year. The correct figure would probably be double that number. Another statistic. Here in the city of Los Angeles, the number of reported suicides is greater than the number of deaths by automobile. Or try this figure. During the course of this program, someone, somewhere in the United States, will kill himself. Someone whose cries for help went unheeded, or unheard, or unwanted. I'm David Prowett, Science Editor for National Educational Television. On this program, we're going to learn a few of the facts about suicide and discover some of the means of preventing it.
Suicide Prevention Center, may I help you?
The Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Center was founded just 10 years ago in 1958. The first professionally staffed center of its kind in the United States, a pilot project in the region of the country with the highest suicide rate.
The most immediate and obvious thing, and frequently the most difficult thing to do, is to recognize the fact that the person who is suicidal is asking for help.
Dr. Norman Farborough, clinical psychologist and co-founder of the center.
And if there is a response to it, then the cry is being answered. Now, it need not necessarily be an immediate personal reaction, but it's the evidence of interest and concern which is really most important in this whole process of working with suicidal people.
Dr. Farborough, why do people commit suicide?
Usually it's because they've arrived at some state of feeling within themselves that makes it feel as if it's no longer worthwhile to continue in this life. They've arrived at this particular state most often because of some difficulty in relationship with other people.
Is this person, this suicidal person, a terribly unstable man or woman?
Not terribly. That is, suicide does occur in practically every level of emotional stability and instability along the continuum, and a lot depends then on the kind of circumstances that persons will find themselves in. Some people just would never even consider the idea. There are some people who, however, to whom this idea occurs relatively easily, and it may be for a number of different reasons.
Is a person who is contemplating suicide mentally ill?
This question that's been asked often, I answer that categorically as no, and very frequently find that there are people who object to this. But the reason why I differentiate in this area myself is that I feel it's necessary to make a distinction between mental illness, as we know it, and emotional disturbance. All of us become emotionally disturbed. Not all of us become mentally ill.
Is suicide an inherited trait? Does it run in a family?
No, no. This is a myth. We've never found that it has been something which is inherited, no more, for example, than the ability to speak one particular language. You just simply are exposed to that language, and you learn to speak it from the time of childhood on up.
With the astonishingly high number of suicides and suicide attempts, I believe when you and I were talking before, you mentioned a figure close to 500,000 people per year. Why is so little being done?
For a long time, unhappily too long, suicide was so much of a taboo subject that it was very difficult even to find people in scientific situations ready to investigate it. It was difficult to obtain funds to carry out a research program for it. Suicide has been a taboo subject for as long as recorded history exists. There are still 9 states in the United States that have laws against suicide. And in addition, there are about 18 states that have laws against aiding and abetting suicide.
Do you feel that these laws are justified?
No, from what we've been able to determine, having a law against suicide doesn't deter the acting.
Is the incidence of suicide related to the times, the social climate?
Oh, yes. I think we have found that there is a kind of negative relationship with the socioeconomic situation. The rate goes up in bad times and goes down in good times. It goes down in time of war, and in large degree seems to reflect the way in which the people are living at the point.
Well, can you describe a prime candidate for me? Prime candidate for suicide?
Yes, and if we look at people who have committed suicide, then you find that the person is generally a male. He's in his 40s and early 50s, perhaps. He is having problems with his family, with his wife, perhaps, or with his fiancée, somebody in his loved situation. He may be having trouble with his own work situation, too. Very often you will find part of this some kind of difficulty in a physical illness.
Then the potential suicide is a man who is suffering from a long-term depression and under a high degree of stress.
Mm-hmm.
Well, given these symptoms, which we've all suffered from at one time or another to some degree, how can you spot the potential suicide? What are the symptoms?
Oh, generally, you can recognize this by the fact that the person will begin to talk about it, and he'll also behave in ways which will arouse concern or suspicion that this is what he's thinking about it. You can think of it in terms of maybe 4 particular criteria. First of all is depression. Depression is one of the most common symptoms, but not always the symptom. It may occur in other ways as well. Then there is exhaustion. There is physical and emotional exhaustion, especially, and we've mentioned this before. Then there is a tremendous amount of anxiety and agitation that begins to appear, and along with this then detachment, separation, and withdrawal, as the person no longer feels himself in communication or able to have people understand and hear his cry for help.
But a person's friends or family doesn't usually ask questions like these. What professional help is available?
I'd like to start back a little earlier. I wish that his friends were open and more receptive. I wish his family were more open and receptive. This is one of the reasons why I'd like some of the taboos to diminish. If not that, then I think there are possibilities through the clergymen. They're very helpful. Through physicians. The family doctor is one of the best of the resources. And then often through the family doctor, it becomes possible to be referred to some of the psychiatric and professional mental health agencies.
Is suicide always an overt act, like jumping out of a window or hanging?
No, this is only the most obvious kind of self-destructive behavior. What has been most intriguing is the extension of this whole concept now to include the fact that indirect self-destructive behavior occurs in many different ways. And this brings in an important concept of intention to die. The intention may express itself in along a continuum from a very overt, very direct fashion to an indirect and long-term and kind of devious way. So many of our researches now have been in this particular area and very fascinating. We find, for example, that we're getting into areas now considered much more normal and much more usual and much more acceptable. People use physical illnesses to shorten their own lives and to produce self-injuries, but if you ask them, they have no idea that they are doing this, or they will deny vehemently. And I guess if we want to get down to things which are even more current, there is smoking, and people will disregard the notice on the pack, and there's the drinking and the drugs and the overeating and the like, which are some of the more psychological aspects.
Hello, this is Dr. Wold.
Hello?
Hello.
Doctor?
Yes.
Can you help me?
Yes.
I feel just awful.
Oh, sounds like you do.
I'm just, I don't know where to turn. I don't know if you can help me. I don't know if anybody could help me.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you do need some help. What's the nature of the problem?
Oh, there's so many. But mostly it's my children. And I don't know how I'm going to be able to get them back, and they're gone. And I don't see very much point to going on without them. They mean everything to me.
Yeah, I see.
And I haven't seen them since October. And I just am so sick. I just want to feel well again. And I want somebody to be able to help me get some rest.
The great majority of people who have made a suicide attempt or thought about it go through a crisis in their lives when they are feeling suicidal, and then they recover from it completely. So that it's only a minority that continue to be suicidal and make more attempts.
Dr. Robert Littman, chief psychiatrist and co-director of the Los Angeles Clinic with Dr. Farborough.
Complete suicide.
Well, what's the prognosis for someone who has actually attempted suicide and survived?
That depends largely upon the personality of the person before he made his suicide attempt. People who make suicide attempts, about half of them have had a basically stable personality with reasonably good personal relationships and achievement, and they have had some reverse in their lives which brought on the suicide attempt, and they usually make an excellent recovery and go on to reconstitute their lives, and only 5 or 10% of them get into any more trouble connected with suicide. But those people who have been unstable before a suicide attempt, who have had many different jobs or much unemployment and many different interpersonal relationships, much divorce and failures to ever settle down, these people have a great deal of difficulty, often go on to make repeated suicide attempts in their frustration and their loneliness. So this is especially true of alcoholics and drug addicts. I want to specify especially alcoholics. Now, in order to recover from alcoholism, many persons have to go through a stage where they sort of hit bottom, and they are left to face the fact that they have, to a large extent, made a mess of their lives and destroyed their personal relationships. And at this time, while they're trying to decide whether they should quit alcohol and make another move, they are highly suicidal. And it's very difficult to know what's the right thing to do to help them, because they do have to wrestle this out with themselves. And yet, if they make a decision towards suicide, then we've lost someone who might have been salvaged.
Dr. Littman, what should a concerned person do if he sees someone who may be contemplating suicide?
I think he, first of all, should feel that it is part of his role as a friend to stay in touch with the person, to find out more about it, to offer some understanding and sympathy, and possibly, if he feels that his own abilities are too limited, to seek additional help.
Well, should you actually talk to a friend about, ask him whether he's contemplating suicide?
Yes, I think so. At a certain point, that's part of honest friendship and relationship with someone who's in trouble, and I think that's maybe even a test of friendship, is the ability to talk honestly about important things. Certainly there's nothing more important than a person who feels his life isn't worth living anymore. Now, some people have thought that this might suggest suicide to someone or encourage him. And in California, for instance, it's against the law to encourage or aid or abet or participate in someone else's suicide. However, I have not seen true friendship and the discussion of suicide with an aim at helping out encourage someone else's suicide.
What about the widespread popular myth that if a person talks about suicide, you really don't have to pay too much attention to him because he won't do it?
That's like the myth that barking dogs don't bite. And the only truth in it is that they don't bite you while they're still barking.
Is a person who is seriously contemplating suicide aware of what he's doing, aware of the irrevocable nature of his act?
Only to a limited degree. It's hard for any of us to really understand death, and the more upset and disturbed we are, the less we can understand it. People that are in some sort of a suicidal crisis nearly always have a sort of tunnel vision about their problems. Let me give some examples. About a third of the people who have committed suicide have left notes that we find and can read, which they often try to give a reason. Now, about 60 a year in Los Angeles will give as a reason for suicide that they have incurable cancer. And in about half those cases, they do not have cancer. They had a false belief. A similar thing happens in the case of suicide notes that give pregnancy as a reason for the suicide. Here again, in about half those cases, the woman is not really pregnant, had a wrong belief about herself. And these are dramatic illustrations of something that happens in the great majority of suicides, that the individual has misevaluated the situation he is in. To him, it seems hopeless, but it's really a mistake.
Your research here at the center has...
May I interrupt?
Of course.
I might say that this is probably the greatest value of a suicide prevention telephone service, in that it gives the suicidal-prone individual a chance to reevaluate his situation in conversation with someone else who might see it from a different point of view.
And possibly suggest other alternatives.
Exactly.
Some of your research has indicated a correlation between suicide and violence. Can you explain why?
There are an important category of individuals who, when they feel that they have given up on life, when they feel hopeless and that they have nothing left to lose, become violent, that it triggers off a violent reaction in them. And really, there's nothing more dangerous than the person who feels he has nothing to lose.
The statistics indicate that suicide is the third-ranking cause of death among adolescents. What are the special problems that young people face that would give rise to this?
Well, all adolescents have the great problem of leaving home and becoming individuals in their own right. I think it's especially difficult for young men, and there's more suicide among young men. We did a study of adolescent suicides in Los Angeles. We found that among the girls that committed suicide, nearly all of them had made themselves known to helping authorities through previous suicide attempts or through disturbed behavior at juvenile hall. They came from bad home situations, by and large, and people had been trying to help them, although maybe not enough. In the case of young men who committed suicide, over half of these men came from stable families, and no one had predicted that they were in any psychological trouble, and the suicide came as a great surprise to many people. These young men tended to be quiet, well-behaved, maybe a trifle isolated, but had shown no great social disturbance. And in talking with the parents and friends, teachers of these adolescents, I had the impression that for many of these young men it was very difficult to leave home, to step out into the world, that it frightened and depressed them, and that they had come from homes where a free discussion of feelings of fear or discouragement was not permitted. That one was supposed to keep a stiff upper lip, you know, and be a man, and often their fathers were sort of very manly persons with interest in guns, and that having a gun around the house does provide an easy opportunity for someone who is temporarily suicidal to make it permanent. So in summary, I would say that the main problem for adolescents is leaving home and still bringing along with them something of security.
What hopes does research hold for being able to deal with this great problem of suicide? Would drug therapy be part of an answer?
Yes. Drug therapy is right now is moving ahead in two areas with great speed. One is in the treatment of depression, and second is in the treatment of mental confusion, which we sometimes call lump under the head of schizophrenia. For example, about 10 or 12% of our suicides occur in people whose thinking is so fragmented that we would call them insane. This kind of confused thinking responds very well to strong tranquilizer drugs and reduces the suicidal crisis considerably. However, we need improvement there because we're still getting some suicide in people shortly after they leave mental hospitals while they're taking these drugs. Now, in the treatment of depression, there's a whole new class of drugs called antidepressants, which are being developed and improved, which are quite effective in helping people, many people, recover from the paralyzing immobilization of depression, from the feeling of utter hopelessness and an inability to think and act. So that in that regard, the research is giving us some help from a physiological point of view. But we need research in 100 different areas connected with this problem.
A report published by the World Health Organization in the last few months indicates that at least 1,000 people commit suicide throughout the world on an average day. For every completed suicide, there are 8 to 10 attempts. This means a worldwide rate of 4 to 5 million suicide attempts a year. One of the myths surrounding suicide is that it's a compulsion only of the rich and famous. Headlines tell us of the deaths of celebrities like Marilyn Monroe and Ernest Hemingway. But the statistics show that suicide touches millions more, and without regard to economic condition or social position. Be aware of the warning signs of suicide. Help is available to those who need it. There are now more than 100 centers like this spread across the nation. And there are many other resources close at hand, such as your family physician, religious counselor, professional psychiatric specialists, and community social agencies. A person attempting suicide is gambling with death, letting his life ride on his odds for survival. The bets are his despair against your love and understanding. The stakes are his life. And it's a game you can both win if you answer his cry for help. This is David Prowett, NET, at the Suicide Prevention Center in Los Angeles.
Hello, doctor? Can you help me